A white man sneered at a black CEO's kids in first class, but the very next day, his entire career disappeared overnight. He sneered at two kids in first class, mocking that they didn't belong there. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The first-class cabin shimmered under warm, golden lights, casting soft glows on the leather seats and polished wood trim. Dominic Calhoun stepped inside with his sons, Marcus and Julian, walking just behind him, their wide eyes darting around in awe. The boys moved with quiet excitement, dressed in matching navy blue hoodies and dark jeans, their sneakers squeaking faintly against the carpeted aisle. Dominic's tailored charcoal gray blazer hugged his shoulders as he guided them forward, his leather briefcase tucked securely under his arm. They reached their seats, 3A, 3B, and 3C, plush and spacious near the window. Marcus claimed the window seat immediately, pressing his face against the glass to watch the airport crew move about below. Julian sat beside him in the middle, still hugging the small digital camera Dominic had given him for the trip. "This is crazy," Marcus whispered, grinning. "We've never had seats this big, Dad." Dominic smiled faintly and adjusted his cufflinks. "Told you it would be different." Behind them, 2 rows down, a pale man in a stiff gray suit settled into seat 5C. He wore thin-framed glasses, slicked-back hair, and a watch so polished it reflected the cabin lights. Raymond Thorne. He eyed the twins with sharp disapproval, lips pressed into a thin line. He exhaled once, long and audible, and opened a silver laptop with unnecessary force. Dominic noticed the sound but didn't look back. His focus remained on helping Julian stow the camera safely into the seat pocket and pulling out a few light snacks he had packed. Still, he felt it. The kind of silence that isn't quiet, the kind that waits for someone to justify its coming storm. As the flight attendants completed the final checks, one man approached their row with a smile and offered them pre-takeoff refreshments. Marcus declined politely. Julian whispered a soft thank you as he took a ginger ale. Dominic declined with a nod, his eyes scanning the safety instructions even though he had flown hundreds of times before. He was determined that tonight would be smooth. The board meeting in Vera City was crucial, a make-or-break presentation for Kelyos Systems' partnership deal with a major infrastructure firm. But more than that, he wanted his sons to remember this night for the right reasons. A promise fulfilled. A peaceful journey. The plane began to taxi. Engines hummed low and steady. The boys leaned into their seats, buckled in and brimming with curiosity. Julian turned to him and whispered, "Do we get to pick our meals too?" Dominic chuckled softly. "Absolutely. First-class perks." Behind them, Raymond Thorne watched. His fingers drummed on the armrest, tapping a rhythm not in sync with anything but his own irritation. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, Marcus, in his excitement, adjusted the seat's recline. Not much, just a few inches. Enough to trigger it. Raymond exhaled again. Louder this time. He leaned slightly forward, then muttered, "Of course," under his breath, shaking his head. Dominic heard it. Not just the sound, but the tone. A condescension he knew too well. He straightened slightly, not turning, but aware now that the peace of the flight was fragile. "Everything all right back there?" Dominic asked evenly, not confrontational, just firm. Raymond didn't respond. He returned to his laptop and typed with short, sharp keystrokes. The boys missed the exchange entirely. They were scrolling through pictures they had just taken, Marcus showing Julian a blurry shot of the runway lights, Julian giggling. Dominic smiled faintly. He would not allow a stranger's bitterness to stain this moment. But tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. The attendants moved about calmly, but Dominic noticed that one of them glanced toward Raymond and then quickly away. He lowered his gaze and focused on his tablet, flipping through the presentation slides. His mind tried to stay on graphs, numbers, projections, but something kept pulling him back to that silent disapproval behind him. It wasn't just the look. It was the way Raymond watched them, as if their presence in first class was an error, as if 3 black passengers, 2 of them children, had disrupted the balance of something he believed he owned. Dominic had endured many such looks in boardrooms, hotels, and elevators, but this was different. His sons were here. They were watching, learning, absorbing everything. He could not let this flight become their lesson in how the world sees them, at least not without showing them how to rise above it. He leaned toward the boys. "Everything good?" Julian nodded quickly. "Best night ever?" Dominic smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. From 2 rows behind, Raymond's gaze narrowed. His jaw tightened as he listened to the boys' voices. He reached forward and pressed the call button. A faint ding echoed. One of the male attendants walked over. "Yes, sir?" Raymond leaned in slightly, voice lowered but loud enough to carry. "Those children are a distraction." "They shouldn't even be here." The attendant hesitated. Dominic's head lifted slightly. "I'm sorry?" the attendant asked, puzzled. Raymond didn't back down. "They've been moving around, making noise. This is first class. Some of us are trying to work." The cabin grew quiet. Eyes shifted. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his newspaper. Dominic said nothing. He placed his tablet down slowly and looked to his sons. Marcus's posture stiffened. Julian looked down at his lap. The attendant cleared his throat. "Sir, they haven't broken any rules." "And they've been very well behaved." Raymond shook his head. "First class is for professionals, not for kids treating it like a playground." Dominic rose partway in his seat, calm but deliberate. His voice was steady, clear. "My sons are seated where they belong. Please don't involve them in whatever this is." Raymond met his gaze. His lips curled slightly. "You'll see what happens when people sit where they don't belong." Dominic stared at him, not moving. The attendant stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. Marcus touched his father's arm. "Should we move?" he asked quietly. Dominic's heart clenched. "No," he replied, his voice low. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." The silence afterward was thicker than before. Raymond returned to his laptop with a smug flick of the wrist. Dominic sat down again, slowly. He looked at his sons, then toward the aisle where no one else spoke. And in his mind, a shift occurred. This trip was no longer about simply reaching Vera City. It was about something far greater. Dominic did not know that what began as a simple family trip would turn into a public storm. The chime of the call button broke the soft hum of the aircraft. Heads turned as the glow above Seat 3C lit up. Raymond Thorne, upright and rigid in his seat, raised one hand slightly, the other still clutching a tablet he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His face, pale and tight with irritation, was angled directly toward the front of the cabin, toward Dominic and his sons. A young male flight attendant named Colin approached with a courteous nod, notebook in hand. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" "Yes," Raymond said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "I've got a problem. Those 2 kids," he jabbed a thumb forward, "are being disruptive. They're whispering, giggling, and moving too much. This is first class, not a school bus." Dominic turned slightly in his seat, his posture still composed, though his spine had gone rigid. His twin sons, Marcus and Julian, sat wide-eyed, unsure if they should look back or freeze. Julian clutched a miniature puzzle cube in his lap. Marcus glanced nervously at his father, waiting for his cue. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," Colin said, attempting to soften the tension. "But they haven't broken any rules. Just maybe give them a little space." "It's a long flight," Raymond scoffed. "Rules? It's not about rules, it's about standards. This is a cabin for professionals. You can't just let anyone in here because they have points or a promotion." Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Julian's knee, the universal signal of reassurance. "We're fine, boys," he said in a low, calm tone. "Just relax. Don't let it bother you." Colin blinked, visibly flustered, unsure if he should press further. "Sir, if you could please lower your voice." "Why?" Raymond interrupted. "I'm saying what everyone else is thinking." His voice wasn't shouting, but the words cut like steel across the silence. A few passengers glanced away, pretending to ignore the scene. One man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, lowering his magazine. Another reached for his water without drinking. Tension cracked like dry ice beneath the cabin's surface. Marcus tugged lightly on Dominic's sleeve, his small voice barely audible. "Dad? Should we move?" Dominic's heart tightened, not in anger, but in grief. That question, so soft, so careful, landed harder than Raymond's accusations. He looked down at his son's face, wide-eyed and earnest, the weight of confusion pressing against those young shoulders. "No," Dominic replied gently. "You have every right to sit where you are." Raymond gave a smug chuckle. "We'll see about that." Colin looked from Raymond to Dominic, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Calhoun, I'll check back shortly." "Please let me know if you need anything," he said diplomatically before walking off, still scribbling into his pad. Raymond leaned back, folding his arms. His voice was no longer directed at anyone specific, but every word was a thinly veiled attack. Standards are falling everywhere. These seats used to mean something. Dominic didn't respond. He could feel the stare burning into his back, but he refused to give Raymond the reaction he wanted. He pulled out his tablet, tried to resume reviewing the presentation slides for the board meeting in Vera City, but his eyes skimmed past the words without absorbing them. Julian shifted beside him, whispering, "Is it because we're kids?" Dominic looked at both his sons. "It's because some people think they get to decide who belongs. But they don't. Ever." The flight returned to a strained silence. A low rumble of engines filled the awkward void left in Raymond's wake, but the mood had changed. The air felt heavier, electric with unease. Dominic knew then that this would not be the last time Raymond tried to escalate. The man had drawn a line and expected Dominic to step over it, to rise in anger, to give him the reaction he was hunting for. But Dominic would not let that happen. Not for his own pride, not in front of his sons. He turned to Marcus and Julian again, his voice low but firm. "Listen to me. When someone tries to make you feel small, it's not because you are, it's because they're scared you aren't." Marcus nodded slowly, the gears of comprehension turning behind his serious eyes. Julian took a deep breath and squeezed his father's hand. Raymond, now sipping from his glass of water with theatrical calm, muttered just loud enough for Dominic to hear, "You'll see what happens when people sit where they don't belong." Dramatic irony swelled like a gathering storm cloud above the cabin. What Raymond couldn't see, what none of the passengers yet knew, was that Dominic Calhoun had faced far worse than sideways glances and whispered judgments. He had built a company from nothing, faced down boardrooms filled with smirking gatekeepers who thought the same thoughts Raymond had just voiced. And each time Dominic didn't rage, he dismantled. The stage was set. Raymond believed he had simply shamed a father. In reality, he had just planted the seed of his own undoing. In Raymond's mind, he was just shaming a father. In reality, he had just planted the seed of his own undoing. "Excuse me, Captain." Raymond Thorne's voice rang out with performative concern as he stood halfway up in his seat, his hand dramatically raised to flag down a passing flight attendant. "There's an issue here in first class. These boys spilled juice all over me, and they've been aggressive since takeoff." The sudden accusation cracked the cabin's soft hum of conversation like a dropped glass. Heads turned. Several passengers peered over the tops of their seats to glimpse the scene. In 2A and 2B, Marcus and Julian froze. Marcus's face twisted in confusion. Julian's cheeks flushed red, his lips parting in disbelief. Dominic Calhoun turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable at first. "That's a lie," he said, voice calm but firm. "My sons haven't left their seats, and no such incident happened." Raymond let out a theatrical sigh and wiped at his sleeve, which appeared perfectly dry. "I suppose we all have different standards for what happened, don't we?" he sneered, glancing at the man seated across the aisle who seemed too uncomfortable to respond. Julian's lower lip began to tremble. His eyes welled up, and within moments tears streamed silently down his cheeks. He buried his face into his father's arm, overwhelmed not just by the accusation, but the shame of being so publicly humiliated. Dominic reached across to gently place a hand on Julian's back. Inside, he was seething, but on the outside, he wore composure like armor. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what his children would remember and what the world watching this moment would assume to be true. He looked up, scanning the cabin. The flight attendant who had heard the complaint appeared caught between procedure and common sense. Other passengers were murmuring. Some looked at the children with sympathy, others with uncertainty. The atmosphere had shifted from calm to contentious in seconds. "If I may," Dominic said, rising slightly but not stepping into the aisle. His voice was steady, deliberate. "My name is Dominic Calhoun. These are my sons, Marcus and Julian. We boarded quietly. We sat quietly. They have not spilled anything, nor have they spoken out of turn. We have done nothing but occupy the seats we paid for." His words traveled through the cabin with gravity, laced with clarity rather than defensiveness. A few passengers nodded, others looked unsure, and then there was Raymond, smirking, leaning back in his seat as though satisfied with the tension he had stirred. Dominic sat down again and reached slowly into the side pocket of his carry-on. From it, he retrieved his phone and tapped the record button under the table, tilting it subtly toward Raymond. He had no desire to escalate, but something told him this was only the beginning. The man behind him wasn't just loud, he was calculated. Moments earlier, Raymond had muttered under his breath about kids these days, and money not buying class, and Dominic had let it slide. But now, with a false complaint lodged and whispers echoing through the cabin, the stakes had shifted. He had to think not just as a father, but as a man who understood the power of evidence and silence. Julian, still shaking, looked up with red eyes. "Dad, why would he say that about us?" Dominic paused, exhaling through his nose. "Because some people feel stronger when they make others feel small." "But that doesn't make them right, son. It just makes them loud." Raymond chuckled lowly, loud enough for only their row to hear. "You play the victim well," he said, not turning his head. Dominic didn't respond. Instead, he leaned toward Marcus, who had remained quietly furious, gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "Look at me," Dominic said softly. Marcus turned. "You are not what that man says you are. You belong here, and you will not carry his lies in your heart. Understood?" Marcus nodded, blinking fast. The plane trembled slightly as it adjusted altitude. The captain's voice came over the speaker with a calm announcement about the weather ahead and the flight's expected arrival time. But below that surface, something more turbulent was brewing in row 2. A man, 2 rows ahead, glanced back as if trying to place Dominic's face. One woman, seated in 3D, gave a subtle shake of her head and leaned back into her seat. The cabin was divided, not openly hostile, but uncertain, and that was almost worse. Silence, Dominic had learned, often helped lies spread faster than noise. He adjusted the phone slightly again. Raymond was now shifting in his seat, unaware that his smug commentary was being captured with every breath. "You think being polite makes you better than everyone else?" Raymond whispered sideways, just loud enough. "Newsflash, some seats can be bought, but not earned. That includes yours." Dominic said nothing. He focused on Julian, who had begun to calm down, and on Marcus, who was still fuming. The lesson had to be clear. Retaliation wasn't strength. Proof was. Raymond continued to sip from his glass of water, savoring the moment. To him, this was about dominance, about watching a father squirm. He believed he was winning. But Raymond had made a mistake. Several, in fact. He underestimated who Dominic Calhoun was, what kind of mind he carried behind his calm eyes, and what kind of legacy he was teaching his sons to build. And he had underestimated just how long a phone's battery could last, or what it could record in silence. Foreshadowing hung thick in the air like the recycled cabin air itself. The captain's voice returned briefly and the plane continued its smooth journey. But for Dominic, this flight had become something else, a crucible. He was no longer preparing for a boardroom presentation. He was preparing for a war of perception, power, and truth. He knew exactly how it would end. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He just needed to keep recording, keep watching, keep his sons safe. Let Raymond keep talking, because the man didn't realize that every word was already being saved, every lie captured, every insult documented. And one day soon, those words would echo far beyond this cabin. What Raymond saw as an easy victory was the very rope he would use to strangle his own reputation. Your money can buy seats, but not respect. Raymond Thorne's voice sliced through the soft cabin hum like a jagged knife, sharp and purposeful. The sentence didn't shout, but it echoed, hanging in the air longer than it should have. Passengers in the nearby rows stiffened. Some looked away, others pretended not to hear, but Dominic Calhoun heard every word. So did his sons. He didn't flinch. Dominic turned slowly, just enough to meet Raymond's eyes for a fleeting second. The man's smirk was confident, the tilt of his head smug. He leaned back as if waiting for Dominic to explode, to shout, to stand, to fulfill some angry stereotype he had already assigned him. But Dominic did none of that. Instead, he shifted back in his plush leather seat and gently leaned toward his sons, placing a calm hand on each of their shoulders. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low but steady, "people try to take your dignity because they've never had any of their own. Don't let their bitterness become your burden. You both belong here." Marcus blinked hard, his throat tight. Julian clutched his tablet with both hands, his lips trembling. Neither boy said a word, but their father's strength steadied them. Dominic's heart twisted. He hated that they had to learn this lesson so soon, but he would make sure they remembered how to face cruelty with composure. Just then, a quiet rustling drew Dominic's attention. A flight attendant, slim, uniform crisp, and clearly unsettled, approached the row with a clipboard in hand. He hesitated, clearing his throat softly. "Mr. Calhoun," the attendant said in a hushed voice, bending slightly at the waist, "I thought you should know. There have been messages sent through the in-flight chat system. A passenger, Mr. Thorne, has been sending remarks, mocking your sons." We flagged them internally. Dominic's spine stiffened. His face remained expressionless, but inside, something moved, like a wire snapping tight. "May I see them?" he asked quietly. The attendant nodded, handing over the printed transcript. Dominic read the first line. "How much do you want to bet those young men snuck up here on a buddy pass?" He kept reading. "First class is a mirror these days, full of people pretending they've earned the view. Bet daddy's on borrowed time like his stock price." Dominic exhaled slowly. His hand tightened on the paper, not enough to crumple it, but enough that the attendant noticed the veins rise against his skin. Yet when Dominic looked up, his face was calm, stone-cold calm, the kind that frightened people more than rage ever could. "Thank you," he said simply. "You did the right thing." The attendant looked relieved. "We'll continue to monitor all messages, sir. Please don't hesitate to call if you need anything." Dominic nodded. As the man walked away, the paper still rested in his hands like a silent warning. Julian leaned close, whispering, "Dad, what does it mean?" "It means," Dominic said, folding the printout carefully and slipping it into the front pocket of his suit jacket, "that some people use words like arrows. But if you're smart enough, patient enough, you catch the arrow before it hits and use it to build your shield." Marcus tilted his head, trying to follow. "So, we're not going to say anything?" Dominic smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it, only resolve. "Not yet." He leaned back in his seat, gaze fixed on the window, but he no longer saw the clouds outside. His mind moved fast, assembling plans like circuit boards in motion. He had seen this kind of behavior before, coated in power, dipped in arrogance, backed by false security. But what Raymond didn't understand was that this wasn't just a disagreement or discomfort. This was documentation. This was intent. And the in-flight messages had crossed the line from rudeness to harassment. Dominic tapped his phone, opening a private notes app and jotting down timestamps, message content, and key phrases. He included the attendant's name, the seat number of Raymond, and marked it all under a new folder. Flight 227, Incident. Then he sent a discreet text to his executive assistant back in Eastbourne. "Track Stratheon Financial VP Raymond Thorne. Get background, all public behavior. Quiet." He didn't need to explain further. His assistant would understand. The machine had started moving. Meanwhile, Raymond chuckled again, this time loud enough to make Marcus flinch. He leaned toward the aisle, pretending to stretch, eyes sweeping the boys with disdain. But he said nothing. He didn't have to. The damage was already intended. But what Raymond didn't know was that his messages had been read, captured, preserved, and his arrogance had not gone unnoticed. Several passengers in the cabin had started exchanging looks. One man across the aisle gave Dominic a slight nod. Another glanced at Raymond, then turned away in disgust. Raymond may have thought he was just blowing off steam, but the cabin had shifted. And so had the story. Dominic glanced at his sons again. Julian was drawing circles with his finger on the edge of the tray table. Marcus stared forward, fists clenched just slightly in his lap. "Remember this moment," Dominic whispered. "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because the most powerful tool a man can use is his silence. But only if he knows how and when to break it." The rest of the flight passed in a tense silence. Raymond didn't send another message, though the smug tilt of his lips never left his face. Dominic didn't rise. He didn't confront. He didn't shout. But every moment he was gathering, preparing, sharpening. Because Dominic Calhoun understood something Raymond Thorne never would. Injustice always leaves a trail. You just have to follow it quietly, until it leads straight to the top. What seemed like silence from Dominic was in truth the sharpening of his blade. The chief steward leaned down beside Dominic's seat, his voice low and guarded, his eyes flicking nervously toward the back of the cabin. "Mr. Calhoun," he whispered, "I need to tell you something privately." Dominic looked up from his tablet, his sons quietly watching a movie beside him, unaware of the tight coil forming beneath their father's calm surface. He nodded, slowly, rising from his seat and following the steward a few feet away, just enough to keep the twins within view but far enough for hushed words to be exchanged. The steward, his name tag read Gregory Hensley, glanced around once more before speaking. "There was a passenger who approached me about your children," Gregory said, voice clipped and tense. "He offered me money to move them to economy, said they were disturbing the atmosphere of first class." Dominic's eyebrows tightened, but his face remained composed. "Which passenger?" Gregory swallowed. "Raymond Thorne." Seat 3DA chill passed through Dominic's chest, cold but strangely confirming. He had suspected Raymond's disdain went beyond insults, but this was calculated cruelty. "He offered you a bribe?" Dominic asked, his voice even, though his jaw clenched. Gregory nodded. "I turned him down immediately, sir. Told him it was unethical and against policy, but I fear he's still filing a complaint through the cabin report system. If it gets logged, even false, it becomes a matter of record. I thought you should know." Dominic stared at him for a long moment. Behind Gregory, the cabin bustled in low chatter and warm light. Attendants poured drinks. Ice clinked into glasses. A woman laughed softly 2 rows ahead. It was a scene of normalcy wrapped around a boiling point. "Thank you for telling me," Dominic said quietly, "and thank you for doing the right thing." Gregory gave a stiff nod, then stepped back toward the galley, disappearing into the hush of service. Dominic returned to his seat, his mind already shifting. His boys looked up at him, Marcus with curiosity, Julian with worry veiled behind a brave face. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Julian asked. Dominic gave them both a small, reassuring smile, but his eyes held gravity. "Everything's fine," he said gently, his voice a soft shelter. "But I need you both to listen very carefully. You've done nothing wrong, and no matter what anyone says, you belong here, just like anyone else." Marcus nodded, eyes wide. "Did that man say something again?" Dominic glanced over his shoulder. Raymond Thorne sat smugly, legs crossed, scrolling through his phone. His expression was unreadable, but Dominic saw it now. This man wasn't just bitter. He was dangerous in the subtle ways that mattered, the kind who used institutions to enforce his prejudice, a man who didn't shout but whispered his hatred into systems that rarely questioned the noise. "He's trying to make trouble," Dominic said quietly, "but we're not going to let him. Not now. Not ever." He picked up his phone and opened the secure chat thread with his assistant, Colby Nance, back in Eastbourne. The screen glowed faintly as the plane cruised through clouds, stars barely visible through the dark windows. His fingers flew across the screen. "Colby, need you to pull full manifest for Flight E-72 from Eastbourne to Vera City. Cross-check all data on passenger Raymond Thorne. Flag anything useful, corporate ties, firm affiliations, board memberships. I'll explain more soon." He hit send. The boys leaned against him now, and Dominic wrapped an arm around each of them. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they prepared for meal service. A tray clinked nearby, wheels whispering down the aisle. But Dominic's mind wasn't on food. It was on leverage. He didn't need to argue with Raymond in a cabin full of whispering strangers. He didn't need to raise his voice or swing back in the air. He would wait, gather, move strategically. Because the real reckoning wouldn't happen at 40,000 feet. It would happen when Raymond least expected it, in rooms he thought he controlled. Raymond's mistake wasn't insulting a man. It was insulting a father, a professional, a strategist, someone who knew how to defend without shouting and strike without warning. Behind him, Raymond chuckled at something on his phone. The sound was sharp and smug, but it carried a desperation now, a hollow confidence. He didn't know the tide was already shifting. Dominic took a slow breath and looked ahead, not at Raymond, but at the horizon that would soon arrive. He wasn't fighting for comfort anymore. He was fighting to show his sons that silence was not weakness and that power did not have to roar. He whispered, half to himself, half for the universe to hear. Raymond had set a fire he believed he controlled, but the blaze was already beyond his reach. Maybe if they had real standards, kids wouldn't be up here playing with seat buttons. Raymond barked loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The words struck like a slap in the quiet, tension-filled air. First-class passengers, previously absorbed in reading lamps or quiet conversation, began lifting their heads. Eyes turned, some curious, others uneasy. Raymond leaned back smugly, crossing one leg over the other, his polished loafer bouncing with smug rhythm. Dominic Calhoun kept his face still, but his jaw tensed. He didn't look back, didn't give Raymond the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he placed a calming hand on Marcus's arm and reached with the other to gently close Julian's tray table, hoping to shield his sons from the brewing hostility. But Raymond wasn't done. He raised his voice again, now projecting across the rows like a man performing for an invisible jury. First class used to be for professionals. Now it's daycare with champagne. There were murmurs, soft gasps, a faint, "Come on," from a man near the front, but no one directly intervened. The cabin crew exchanged glances from the galley. A younger steward shifted uneasily, clearly uncertain whether to approach. Raymond noticed and smiled as if convinced the stage was his. Dominic still didn't respond. He inhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He could feel Marcus watching him, eyes wide and uncertain, the kind of gaze that begged for permission to feel hurt. Dominic opened his eyes and met his son's stare, not with fear, not with anger, but with purpose. Then Marcus did something his father did not expect. Slowly, carefully, he reached beneath the seat and pulled out the backup tablet. With slightly trembling fingers, he tapped the screen and held it up for his father to see. On it played a short clip, grainy but unmistakable. Raymond, during boarding, sneering and muttering, "They're just kids pretending to be rich." Another clip. Raymond, seated and facing slightly toward the camera, hissing, "Can't buy class, no matter how expensive your watch is." Dominic's breath caught in his chest, not from surprise but from the sheer weight of what Marcus had done. He had captured the truth. Silently. Completely. "May I show them?" Marcus asked, his voice hushed but steady. Dominic nodded. "Only if you're ready, son." The boy stood up. Quietly, calmly. No defiance, no theatrics, just a child holding up truth in a world where adults were failing to speak it. "Excuse me," Marcus said to the row behind them. "I think you should see this." The passenger in the adjacent row, a middle-aged man in a blazer, turned, brow furrowed. As the video played, his frown deepened. Others leaned in. The steward from earlier stepped forward cautiously, peering over a shoulder. One by one, the murmurs shifted. Shock replaced discomfort. "Is this real?" the man in the blazer asked. "It's from boarding," Dominic said, finally rising to his feet. His voice was calm but firm, his presence commanding. "My son recorded it after hearing repeated comments. He hoped it wouldn't get worse, but here we are." Raymond's face drained of color. He stood up sharply, knocking his drink sideways. "This is ridiculous. That video's doctored, edited. You can make anyone say anything these days, but the cabin was no longer on his side." The steward approached, nodding respectfully to Dominic. "Sir, would you mind if I take a look?" "Of course," Dominic replied, handing over the tablet. Raymond's eyes darted from passenger to passenger, looking for someone, anyone, to support him. But the tide had turned. "You all saw how disruptive they were," he shouted. "They're ruining the atmosphere for everyone." A voice came from the front. "You mean the atmosphere you've been polluting since we took off?" Laughter, sharp, sudden, rippled from a few rows. Raymond flinched. Dominic gently pulled Marcus back into his seat and sat down beside him. Julian leaned into his father's side, eyes wide, still unsure. "You did the right thing," Dominic whispered to Marcus, his voice thick with pride. Across the aisle, the steward returned the tablet. "Thank you, sir." "We've seen enough for now." He glanced subtly toward the cockpit, then added, "We'll be documenting this." Raymond slumped into his seat, furious, embarrassed, and utterly cornered. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles pale. He muttered under his breath, "You think this is over?" But Dominic didn't flinch. His eyes remained forward. The plane hummed with renewed quiet. Yet the silence felt different now, charged with understanding, thick with unspoken shifts. Dominic leaned in slightly to his sons and said, "Sometimes the storm rages loudest right before it breaks." And in the rows around them, for the first time all flight, no one looked away. The more Raymond tried to climb out, the deeper his words buried him. Raymond leaned forward slowly, like a serpent preparing to strike. His voice was low but venomous, sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin. "Enjoy this ride, boys," he hissed, his eyes narrowed, gleaming with malice. "Because when we land, your father's going to lose everything." Marcus froze, his small hands gripping the armrest. Julian's eyes widened, darting toward his father in silent panic. The words hit harder than turbulence, words meant not just to intimidate, but to scar. Raymond's tone carried a cruel certainty, like a man convinced of his power. He leaned back with a satisfied smirk, adjusting his cuffs as if he had simply rearranged furniture. Dominic rose. Not quickly, not with a rush of fury, but slowly, with purpose, with weight. His tall frame unfolded from the seat like a storm front rising over calm waters. Every head nearby turned. Conversations ceased. A flight attendant paused mid-pour near the galley, her hands trembling just slightly as she looked over. The quiet throb of the plane's engines became the only sound as Dominic stepped into the narrow aisle, his eyes locked on Raymond with a calm intensity that felt like pressure building before lightning struck. Dominic's voice came low and steady. "You can criticize me. You can sneer. But you do not, ever, threaten children." The sentence landed like a gavel in a courtroom. Several passengers looked away, unable to meet Dominic's gaze. Others watched with growing admiration. The calmness in his tone made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. Raymond scoffed, but the smug edge on his face began to fade. "I didn't threaten anyone. I just stated a fact. Actions have consequences." Dominic didn't flinch. "And so do intentions," he said. "Remember that." The air around them felt charged, like static clinging to every breath. One of the junior attendants, a slender man in his 20s with nervous eyes, quickly turned and disappeared toward the cockpit. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, clear and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've been informed of a disturbance in first class. Let me make it clear, no passenger has violated any flight regulations. I expect all travelers to maintain decorum for the remainder of the journey. Thank you." Raymond's expression twitched. His confidence flickered. He shifted in his seat, suddenly less sure of his footing. The murmurs in the cabin returned, but this time they carried a different tone. No longer whispers of uncertainty, but threads of support. Small nods, exchanged glances, a man across the aisle lifting his brows as if to say, "I saw that too." Dominic inhaled, then slowly returned to his seat. Marcus reached for his father's hand, and Dominic gently took it, squeezing softly. Julian leaned closer, resting against his father's side. "Are we in trouble?" Marcus whispered. "No," Dominic replied, his voice like warm stone, solid, unwavering. "Storms may rage, but justice always lands with the truth." Julian blinked up at him, trying to understand, while Marcus simply nodded, absorbing the words like a quiet vow. Raymond sat frozen behind them. His fingers tapped restlessly against his seatbelt buckle, the tension coiling inside him now redirected. He had expected fury, outbursts, a man breaking under pressure. Instead, he had witnessed something more unsettling, grace under fire, and it had exposed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Dominic's mind, though outwardly calm, was racing. The insult had passed, but the injury remained. Not to his pride, but to the example he was forced to defend in front of his children. His boys had seen the world try to belittle them. Now they would also see how to stand in the face of it, not with fists or shouting, but with unwavering resolve. Outside the windows, the sky darkened as the plane sliced through twilight. Inside, the tension remained thick, yet something had shifted. The passengers who once looked away now looked on. The line had been drawn, and though it hadn't erupted into chaos, the tremor of its approach still vibrated under every step. Raymond stared ahead, cheeks flushed. He swore to himself that this wasn't over. He still had cards to play, still had connections, still had ways to twist perception in his favor. But Dominic wasn't concerned with Raymond's illusions of control. He had already begun preparing, not for vengeance, but for truth to have its stage. He looked down at his sons and whispered once more, this time for them alone. "Justice always lands with the truth?" What began as whispers in the cabin was about to roar through the world. He thought insulting a black CEO's family mid-flight would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe dignity must always be defended, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The moment the plane doors unlocked with a hydraulic hiss, the cabin seemed to tense as one. Passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings, eager to disembark after a tense flight. But for Dominic Calhoun, every second felt suspended. He could already see, through the narrow slit of the slightly ajar cockpit door, two uniformed airport security officers standing at the end of the jet bridge. Their presence wasn't routine. This wasn't a random check. Raymond Thorne had made sure of that. Dominic placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder and offered a nod of reassurance to Julian, who clutched his small tablet against his chest like a shield. Behind them, Raymond rose confidently from his seat, adjusting the sleeves of his blazer and smoothing his slick hair as if stepping into a boardroom. His eyes flashed with victory. He had told security that Dominic had caused a disruption, that he had endangered the flight, and by the look on his face he was certain the performance would hold. As they reached the cabin door, one of the officers raised a hand. "Mr. Calhoun?" the taller guard asked. His voice was neutral but firm. Dominic stopped. "Yes," he replied, his tone calm but steady. "We received a report about a disturbance involving you and your children. We're going to need to speak with you." Raymond stepped forward, seizing the moment. "They should be removed immediately," he said, his voice loud enough for the lingering passengers to hear. "They were a threat to everyone on board." The father was confrontational, the boys were reckless, someone even got hurt. He gestured wildly as if summoning invisible witnesses. Dominic didn't flinch. "You'll want to see this first," he said quietly, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen, opened the saved footage, and handed it to the officer. The video played, Raymond hissing insults under his breath, calling Marcus and Julian seat-stealing brats, sneering that first class used to mean something. Another clip showed him trying to intimidate Marcus, leaning in with veiled threats, his face twisted with disdain. One more video captured Raymond attempting to bribe a steward to move the children out of first class. The security officers watched in silence. Raymond's smirk began to falter. That's edited," he stammered. "That's not how it happened." More passengers, still disembarking, began to slow near the front. One man in a gray suit stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing," he said. "The kids were quiet. That man," he pointed to Raymond, "was the only one causing a disturbance." A second passenger nodded. "He was whispering awful things all flight long." The father stayed calm. "I was 3 rows away. I saw everything." The officer looked up from the phone. "Is there anyone else willing to confirm this?" One by one, passengers turned back. A teenage boy, an older gentleman, even a member of the crew. All stepped forward to affirm the truth. The swell of support was quiet but firm, like a tide turning. Raymond's voice cracked. "You don't understand who I am. I work with—" "Sir," the officer interrupted, his expression now tinged with irritation. "We've heard enough." Raymond's face reddened. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came. His confidence drained visibly, shoulders curling inward as realization settled in. The power he thought he wielded had vanished in an instant. Dominic turned to his sons. "Come on," he said softly. He took Marcus's hand in one, Julian's in the other, and they stepped past the officers, past Raymond, who now stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief, as if they were simply exiting any other flight. Outside the gate, the terminal was filled with movement and announcements oblivious to the drama unfolding within. But for Dominic, the noise faded. His mind was clear, his objective sharpened. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It wasn't just about shielding his sons from shame. It was about ensuring that Raymond's cruelty would not vanish quietly into the air. The fight wasn't over. It was just moving to a different battlefield, one with boardrooms, contracts, and consequences. Dominic adjusted the strap on his carry-on and walked with calm purpose, sons by his side. Raymond remained at the gate, stammering to the guards, his voice growing smaller with every step Dominic took away. What Raymond thought would end with applause for him had only opened the curtains on his downfall. Dominic Calhoun's shoes clicked against the polished tile of the terminal as he walked with quiet resolve, his sons at his side, their small hands still folded tightly in his. The crowd from the flight was dispersing, but the echoes of the incident lingered like smoke. Raymond Thorne stood several paces behind, red-faced and flustered, trapped in an argument with airport security officers who now viewed him not as a victim, but as a man exposed. Dominic said nothing to him. He didn't look back. There was no need. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a gray blazer emerged from the crowd and approached swiftly. Simon Everin, Dominic's executive assistant, who had taken an earlier flight to prepare for tomorrow's board meeting in Vera City. He carried a tablet clutched tightly to his chest, his eyes wide with urgency. As he reached Dominic, his voice dropped to a low, almost reverent tone. "I've got something," Simon said. "Something big." Dominic stopped, eyebrows raised but expression calm. "Talk." Simon turned the tablet around and tapped twice. On screen, a digital profile appeared. Raymond Thorne. Underneath the name, Vice President of Acquisitions, Stratheon Financial Group. But it wasn't the title that made Dominic's eyes narrow. It was the company name. "Stratheon," he repeated slowly. Simon nodded. "They're the ones bidding for the integration software license. The final contract meetings are next month. You're the deciding vote on whether the deal moves forward." Dominic's pulse didn't quicken, but something sharpened behind his gaze. The moment crystallized. Raymond Thorne had not simply insulted a fellow passenger. He had insulted the very man who now had the power to affect the trajectory of his career. The irony was so heavy it almost felt staged. For a moment, Dominic looked past the screen, toward the distant windows glowing with the gold of early evening. Outside, planes taxied across the lit tarmac, indifferent to the weight of human drama inside. He felt Marcus shift beside him. "Daddy?" the boy asked softly. Dominic turned, crouching so he was eye level with both sons. "Do you remember what I said on the plane?" he asked. "About some battles being fought in quiet rooms, not in the air?" The twins nodded, wide-eyed. "Well," he continued, voice calm and deliberate, "we've landed." And now it's time for the quiet room Simon stood by silently as Dominic rose. His presence loomed with authority, not of a man seeking revenge, but of one preparing justice. "Email me everything," Dominic instructed. "I want a full dossier on Thorne, past clients, public interviews, press releases, anything that shows his conduct. If he's done this before, we'll know." Simon nodded, already typing. "And the contract?" "We proceed as planned," Dominic said, "but Stratheon will be told the contract depends on more than just numbers. They'll need to understand that professionalism isn't a suit you wear on Monday and remove on Sunday flights." Simon's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Understood." They moved again, toward the private car service waiting outside. As they walked, Dominic noticed a ripple in the crowd behind them, passengers pointing, whispering. Someone had uploaded the confrontation to social media. A video was playing on a man's phone nearby, Raymond sneering, Dominic standing tall, Marcus's video flashing proof. The truth had taken off faster than any plane. Raymond Thorne was still inside the terminal trying to salvage his pride, unaware that his job was now under the microscope of the very man he had tried to humiliate, that his title, so proudly carried, had become a loose thread. In the quiet of the back seat, Marcus rested his head on his father's arm. Julian leaned against his brother. Dominic didn't speak. His mind was already turning, already building the path ahead, already weighing strategy against impact. Simon called again as they pulled away from the terminal. "One more thing. You'll want to know, Thorne's name is listed on the internal correspondence for the equity division. He's the lead contact for their merger plans. They'll crumble if he's compromised publicly." Dominic exhaled slowly. "Then we won't just make noise. We'll move mountains." He looked once more out the window as the airport lights faded behind them, the gravity of the moment settling into his bones. This was no longer about offense. It was about example. Not punishment for one man, but correction for a culture that allowed men like him to thrive. In the distance, the city lights of Vera flickered like a map of choices yet to be made. The man who mocked two boys for sitting in first class had no idea his own seat was already gone. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Dominic Calhoun stepped into the sleek glass-paneled hallway of Kelyos Systems, his twin sons Marcus and Julian trailing beside him, their eyes still wide from the whirlwind of the night before. The polished floors mirrored their footsteps, the usual hum of the office replaced today by a heavy silence that whispered of expectation. Every face they passed, security guards, receptionists, junior engineers, carried the same look: awe, pride, and unspoken questions. News had traveled fast. The three walked through the main corridor, Dominic's tailored gray suit sharp against the sun-drenched windows. Julian clutched a tablet tightly against his chest. Marcus walked a little closer than usual to his father, his gaze darting left and right, searching for reassurance that they were safe here, that this space, at least, wouldn't turn on them the way the flight cabin had. In the executive boardroom, a tall man with glasses adjusted his tie and rose quickly when Dominic entered. "Morning, Dominic," said Lionel Graves, the company's COO. His voice was steady, but his face held the kind of restrained intensity that only came from overnight crisis monitoring. Around the polished oak table, several other board members nodded in greeting, some rising to offer handshakes, others simply pressing their palms together with respect. "Gentlemen," Dominic said, placing his leather bag on the table. He motioned for his sons to take the 2 chairs in the corner of the room. "They're here to observe." No interruptions. No one objected. Lionel gave the twins a respectful nod and continued. "I think it's safe to say you handled things last night better than any PR strategy we've ever written." Dominic exhaled quietly, his fingers interlacing in front of him as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Damage control is one thing. Dignity under fire is another." "Agreed," said board member Avery Stone, a tall man with a quiet voice who rarely spoke unless it mattered. "But this morning's headlines are all about you. The footage is everywhere. Your calm response, that man's venom. It's gone viral across several business networks. We've had 5 partnership inquiries since 7 a.m. Another member, Joseph Tam, leaned in. "The question is, what now? Strathion called 3 times. Their vice president of communications is requesting an urgent meeting." Dominic's lips tightened. "I'll take their call in a moment." He turned to Marcus and Julian, offering a small, encouraging smile before standing and stepping toward the window. The skyline stretched beyond the glass, cranes towering above buildings still under construction, a reminder that the world was always building or tearing something down. His reflection stared back at him, composed, thoughtful, but with the shadow of fatigue just beneath his eyes. He remembered the moment on the plane when Julian had cried silently, unsure why a stranger hated them so deeply. That pain stayed with him. His assistant, Kareem, entered briskly from the adjoining room, holding a tablet. "It's Strathion." They're patched through to the conference screen. Dominic nodded once. The boardroom lights dimmed, and a large screen flickered to life. 3 executives from Strathion Financial appeared, red-eyed, corporate, their ties just slightly loosened in panic. At the center was Gareth Linton, the firm's chief partnership officer, flanked by 2 silent aides. "Mr. Calhoun," Gareth began, his voice controlled but brittle, "we want to extend our deep regret for the incident on Flight 417. Mr. Thorne's behavior does not represent Strathion's values. We're conducting an internal review." Dominic raised a hand, not harshly but with finality. "Let's skip to why you called." Gareth swallowed hard. "We would like to reassure you that our ongoing contracts with Kelyos Systems are still a top priority. We hope to resolve this matter quietly and respectfully." A quiet hum of disapproval moved through the boardroom. Dominic's jaw clenched just slightly. He walked slowly back to his seat, his voice steady but commanding. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Linton. Your firm does not get to humiliate my children and then request discretion. If you want Kelyos Systems to continue any form of engagement, the terms are simple. Accountability must be public. Not whispered apologies, not internal memos." Gareth shifted, clearly unprepared. "Dominic, surely." "Mr. Calhoun," Dominic corrected. Gareth nodded quickly. "Of course." "Mr. Calhoun. But wouldn't a public action risk making this even bigger than it already is?" Dominic leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen. "That's the point. If your concern is exposure, then you're not concerned about your values. You're concerned about your image. My concern is setting a standard. You want to rebuild this bridge? Do it in the open, or don't bother at all." Silence fell. The tension was thick. Behind Dominic, Marcus's foot tapped nervously against the floor. Julian sat frozen, holding his breath. On screen, Gareth's expression darkened with helplessness. One of his aides whispered something into his ear. Gareth nodded faintly. "We'll discuss this with our internal leadership and get back to you within the hour." Dominic didn't respond. He reached forward and tapped the screen off. The room was quiet again. Then Lionel spoke. "You just backed them into a corner." "No," Dominic said, turning slowly to his sons. "I opened a door. It's up to them whether they walk through it." Marcus met his father's eyes. "What if they don't?" Dominic smiled faintly, but the steel in his voice was unmistakable. Then we show them that silence has consequences. Behind him, the skyline gleamed under a rising sun, casting long shadows across the boardroom floor. The shield Raymond trusted was already crumbling to dust. The email arrived just past midnight. Dominic was still in his study, the soft hum of the air purifier the only sound as he reviewed policy documents on his tablet. Marcus and Julian had long gone to bed in the guest room down the hall, and the house was still. The glow of the screen lit his face as he scanned the bolded subject line. Confidential. You need to see this about Raymond Thorne. He paused, his fingers hovering over the trackpad. A chill ran down his spine, not fear, but recognition. This was the moment. He opened the message. There was no name, just a brief note. I work inside Strathion. I've watched too many things get covered up. Raymond's not just reckless, he's protected. These files were buried, but I've pulled them. You deserve to know attached were 6 documents, all time-stamped, all marked as internal. Dominic opened the first. It was an email from Raymond to another executive, sarcastically titled, Affirmative Action All Stars. The contents made Dominic's jaw tighten. Jokes about minority hires, references to seat fillers and diversity optics, even a sneering remark about a Kelyos candidate who had once interned at Strathion. Dominic clicked through each file slowly, deliberately, feeling a cold knot twist in his chest. These weren't one-off comments. They were patterns, and they weren't hidden by accident. They had been protected. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. For a long moment, he didn't move. The quiet of the house amplified the weight of what he now held. This wasn't just about Raymond insulting his sons or trying to embarrass him on a flight. This was a man enabled by an entire system, a culture so practiced in its silence that it had turned apathy into policy. He forwarded the files to his legal counsel with a note. Prepare a statement. Not now, but soon. This must be strategic. A floorboard creaked. Dominic turned as Marcus stepped into the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his voice a sleepy whisper. You're still up, Dad? I am, Dominic said, his voice calm. Marcus walked in, blinking at the soft blue light of the screen. Is it about that man on the plane? Dominic nodded once. Partly. Why don't you just tell everyone what he did? Marcus asked, climbing into the chair across the desk, folding his knees up to his chest. Why don't you just fight him back? Dominic looked at his son carefully. The question came from a place of hurt, but also confusion, a child's yearning for immediate justice. Because, Dominic said slowly, battles of dignity aren't won by breaking a man. They're won by showing the world his cracks. Marcus tilted his head, trying to grasp the meaning. Dominic continued, If I shout, it becomes noise. If I wait and shine light where no one wants to look, that's when people finally see what's been hidden. From the hallway, Julian's sleepy voice called out, Marcus! Where'd you go? Marcus slid off the chair. Coming, he said, then looked back at his father. Will they see it? What he really is. Dominic gave a faint smile. They will. And not just him. As Marcus disappeared down the hallway, Dominic turned back to his screen. His counsel had already responded. Received. These will make an impact. But we must time this perfectly. Dominic knew that timing wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a lesson for his sons. Injustice must be exposed not with rage, but with precision. The documents wouldn't be leaked tomorrow, or even the next day. They would be held until the world's eyes were already watching, when the cost of looking away became too high. He stood, stretching his arms, and walked to the window. The city lights blinked below, silent and unaware of what was coming. He pressed a hand to the glass. Raymond Thorne had believed his silence made him untouchable. But Dominic now understood, silence leaves a trail. And when the time was right, that trail would lead straight into the open. Behind him, the files glowed softly on the desk, waiting. Raymond was about to learn that his silence had been his loudest confession. Raymond Thorne's name appeared first on the conference room display. The summit had barely begun when Dominic Calhoun walked in, composed, measured, and flanked by his lead counsel, Andre Leland. Behind the dark-tinted observation glass that lined one side of the sleek high-rise boardroom, two small figures sat watching, Marcus and Julian, silent and wide-eyed, taking in every detail their father had promised would matter someday. Their presence wasn't for show. It was a lesson, a moment meant to imprint. Strathion's leadership had gathered in haste. There were 8 men seated at the long mahogany table, all in dark suits, all exuding the desperation of people who had lost control of the narrative. Some whispered among themselves as Dominic entered, while others glanced nervously at the polished doors behind him. The room carried the sterile chill of high-level damage control. "Mr. Calhoun," began Mason Veller, Strathion's general counsel, his voice too polished to be sincere, "we want to first express our regret for how things unfolded. Raymond's conduct on the flight does not reflect our company's values. We're prepared to act immediately. He'll be terminated today." Dominic didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, eyes steady, arms relaxed at his sides. His silence stretched just long enough to sharpen discomfort into tension. "I'm not here for a private apology," he said at last, his voice low but precise. "I'm here because silence built the problem. And silence won't fix it." Mason cleared his throat, caught off guard. "Of course. But if we move swiftly, internally—" Dominic turned to Andre, who reached into his case and pulled out a sleek tablet. With one tap, the room dimmed as a projection lit the far wall. A file opened, subject line promotions and diversity placements. The first email scrolled across the screen. "These new hires look like charity photo shoots. We're supposed to lead, not babysit quotas." Raymond Thorne. A few executives shifted. One man's lips parted slightly, another lowered his eyes. Dominic waited, then tapped again. More emails followed, each worse than the last. Condescending remarks about junior analysts, mocking nicknames for colleagues based on ethnicity, disdain disguised as humor, always hidden just enough to be overlooked, until now. The room grew still. "This wasn't a single incident," Dominic said. "This was tolerated behavior. It was protected. And now that it's public, you want containment, but I'm not interested in patchwork." He stepped forward, letting the weight of his words hang. "My sons watched that man humiliate them in front of a plane full of strangers. They didn't just see racism. They saw cowardice wearing a suit. And if I walk out of here with a private resolution, I teach them the wrong lesson." Across the table, a senior VP named Braxton Hale leaned forward. "Mr. Calhoun, our goal is resolution, not resistance. We are willing to part ways with Raymond and address the situation internally." "No," Dominic interrupted. "You'll address it publicly. You'll issue a formal statement detailing his removal. Not vague language, not corporate euphemisms. Truth. And beyond that, Strathion will establish an independent accountability board, diverse, external, and with real authority. Because this isn't about one man. It's about the system that let him operate unchecked." The executives sat frozen. Some looked to Mason, others to each other. The gravity of Dominic's terms was undeniable. Not just a demand for punishment, but a demand for structural change. "If those terms aren't met," Andre added, voice steady, "Kelyos Systems will not proceed with the acquisition, and we will publicly state why a cold silence fell over the table." The balance of power had shifted so thoroughly, so swiftly that even those who had once spoken confidently now chose silence. Dominic finally took his seat. It was then that Mason motioned to someone outside the room. The door opened. Raymond Thorne stepped in, paler than before, his confidence visibly fraying. He looked around, scanning faces for allies, finding none. When his eyes met Dominic's, they darted away quickly. "Have you lost your mind?" Raymond muttered under his breath as he approached the table, but his voice cracked just enough to betray the panic behind it. "Sit," Mason ordered curtly. Raymond sat. "We've reviewed the evidence, Raymond," said one of the senior directors. "You're being terminated, effective immediately." Raymond's breath caught. "Wait, I built half your acquisition models. My portfolio holds." "You also built a liability," another director snapped. "We're trying to salvage what's left." Raymond turned toward Dominic as if grasping for a lifeline, eyes flickering with a desperation he couldn't hide. "Mr. Calhoun, Dominic, look, this got out of hand. I was under stress. I didn't mean to." "You meant every word," Dominic said flatly. "You just didn't expect them to follow you off the plane." Raymond's jaw tightened. "Please, you don't have to ruin everything." "Not like this. We can talk, man to man." Dominic rose, slowly. He stepped close enough for only Raymond to hear. His voice, when it came, was quiet but implacable. "I taught my sons that dignity doesn't beg for space, it earns it. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror. And now it's time for you to see what the world saw?" Raymond's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. His words faltered. Please." Dominic turned back to the boardroom, nodding once at Andre, then gestured to the observation window where Marcus and Julian sat, their eyes wide with understanding, not fear. "This isn't about vengeance," Dominic said clearly, facing the room. "It's about correction." Then he looked to Raymond one final time. "Respect is not charity. It's a right." Marcus and Julian stood in silent awe beside their father as the glass doors of Kelyos Systems slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. The morning light poured into the lobby, catching the polished marble floors and making the entire space feel like it glowed. The boys' eyes darted to the massive digital display that greeted every visitor. Rotating across the screen were vibrant posters showcasing the company's new mission initiative. Dignity is non-negotiable. Justice is scalable. Each banner featured bold images of community outreach, leadership mentoring programs, and a newly launched internal ethics board. But what caught their eyes most wasn't the slogans. It was the photo of their father, centered under the words, "A calm voice in the storm." Dominic Calhoun kept walking, flanked by his sons, his stride calm but deliberate. He had returned to this office a different man than the one who had boarded that evening flight weeks ago. Not broken, not bitter, but rebuilt, with steel inside. His hand rested briefly on each of the boys' shoulders, grounding them, reminding them silently, "This is your legacy too." He passed the front desk where Terrell, the lobby concierge, gave a respectful nod, eyes slightly wide with admiration. "Morning, Mr. Calhoun. Your 9 o'clock is ready whenever you are." "Thank you, Terrell," Dominic said, offering a brief but warm smile. The walk from the elevator to the executive floor felt longer than usual, not because of nerves, but because each step echoed with memory. The false accusation, the glare of overhead lights on the tarmac, Raymond's smug sneer, the sound of Marcus's voice trembling as he asked if they should move. And now that same boy walked beside him, chin high, eyes scanning the halls of the company that bore their family name. As they entered the executive suite, a few senior team members stood, clapping softly. Not for show, but out of quiet solidarity. Dominic raised a hand, grateful but focused. Inside the boardroom, a monitor on the far wall displayed a muted news segment. A talking head recapping the corporate shakeup at Strathion Financial. The headline was brutal. "Executive ousted after first-class incident spurs corporate reckoning." The segment cut to a press conference where Strathion's CEO, visibly pale and guarded, announced the implementation of the Calhoun Accountability Model, a framework that Dominic had demanded be adopted before any contracts resumed. The conference room buzzed with murmured admiration, but Dominic stayed silent. He looked at Marcus and Julian seated in the observation room just beyond the glass. They weren't watching the news, they were watching him. That's when he knew what mattered most wasn't the boardroom applause or headlines, it was what they learned by watching how he moved through fire. "Dad," Julian said softly as Dominic walked out after the meeting, "do you think people like Raymond learn anything when they fall?" Dominic knelt slightly, meeting his son's eyes. "Sometimes. But that's not your job to worry about. What matters is that we learn from what they tried to take." Marcus, more thoughtful than his brother, asked, "What did he try to take?" Dominic placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your place. Your pride. Your right to be seen as equals. But he didn't succeed, and he never will if we remember who we are." The three walked slowly through the main hallway again. Staff passed by respectfully. A few nodded. One young intern barely out of college paused awkwardly, then blurted, "Sir, that video of you staying calm, on the flight, it changed how I saw leadership." Dominic gave a small nod. Then it was worth it. As they neared the atrium, Marcus tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can we see the poster again?" Dominic chuckled. "You mean the one with my tired face on it?" "No," Marcus said, "the one with the words." About calm, Dominic turned and looked at it with them. The display glowed silently above the polished reception desk. He didn't say anything at first, just watched his boys study the words. Outside, the city stirred with motion, taxis, bicycles, people heading to offices, unaware of the private battle that had unfolded weeks ago in a metal tube flying through the night. But within these walls, the echoes remained. A notification buzzed on his watch, an alert from his legal counsel confirming the final phase of Strathion's reforms had been implemented. It was done. The humiliation had transformed into a blueprint for something greater. He looked down at his sons, then at the towering glass walls around them. They were not walls of power, but of transparency, of legacy. In the end, Dominic thought as Marcus smiled proudly, the jobs that vanished overnight were nothing compared to the respect that remained forever. Hours later, his whole world collapsed. The same CEO he mocked signed the order that erased his job overnight. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights issues of racism, prejudice, and the hidden consequences of judging others based on race or status. Its purpose is to challenge stereotypes, provoke thought, and inspire empathy and accountability in how we treat one another.